Sometimes the most profound bonds are forged in moments when life hangs by a thread. In the harsh cliffs of ancient Norway, a giant Viking warrior named Ulfarr lived alone, exiled from his people and carrying burdens that weighed heavier than his massive frame. One morning, he heard a desperate cry echoing from the rocky gorge below. A young wolf clung to a narrow ledge, its paws slipping on blood-covered stone. Death waited in the misty depths. Without thinking, Ulfarr climbed down the dangerous cliff and pulled the trembling creature to safety. He expected the wolf to run away. Instead, it stayed by his side. Day after day, the wolf followed him, watched over him, and shared his fire. The two outcasts found comfort in each other's company. But this wolf carried something unusual in its golden eyes, ancient markings that glowed with mysterious power. What could those strange runes mean? And why did saving this wolf feel like awakening something that had slept for centuries? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the peaks of Svartafjall in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape where Ulfarr Ketilsson had made his home for the past 7 winters. His dwelling, carved into the living rock of the mountainside, stood as a testament to both his skill and his solitude. The entrance, barely wide enough for his massive shoulders, opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber where the warmth of a central fire pit chased away the mountain's eternal chill. Ulfar's exile cloak, woven from the pelt of a great bear he had slain in his youth, hung heavy across his broad back as he stepped outside to greet another day. The fur, once a rich brown, had weathered to a mottled grey that matched the Viking's own hair. Each thread told a story of survival, of nights when the wind howled like banshees and the cold threatened to steal the breath from his lungs. But more than that, it carried the weight of his shame, a constant reminder of the choices that had led him to this lonely peak. The wolf padded silently beside him, its silver coat gleaming in the morning light. 3 days had passed since the rescue, and still the creature showed no inclination to leave. Ulfarr had named him Grayling, for the way his fur caught the light like the scales of mountain trout. The animal possessed an intelligence that unsettled him, watching with those golden eyes that seemed to see far more than any beast should. When Ulfarr spoke, which he did more often now than he had in years, Grayling tilted his head as if understanding every word. "Strange thing, having company again?" Ulfarr murmured as he checked his snares along the rocky paths that wound around his mountain home. His voice, roughened by years of disuse, carried the accent of the northern clans, the rolling consonants and measured cadence that marked him as nobility, even in exile. "Last visitor I had was old Bjorn, and that was 2 summers past. Came to tell me my father had finally joined the ancestors." Grayling's ears perked at the mention of the name, and Ulfarr found himself chuckling, a sound that felt rusty in his throat. The wolf had already learned to recognize certain words, responding to food and fire with the enthusiasm of a loyal hound. But it was the quieter moments that revealed the depth of the animal's awareness. When Ulfarr fell into one of his brooding silences, memories of his past life weighing heavy on his mind, Grayling would press close against his leg, offering wordless comfort. The morning's hunting proved fruitful. 2 fat rabbits hung from Ulfar's belt, and he had gathered enough wild herbs to season their evening meal. As they returned to the cave, he caught sight of movement far below in the valley, a line of riders following the old trade route that skirted the base of Svartafjall. From this distance, they appeared no larger than ants, but Ulfar's experienced eye could make out the glint of weapons and the purposeful way they moved. "Warriors, not merchants, raiders most likely," he told Grayling, who had followed his gaze and now stood alert, hackles slightly raised. "Or perhaps clans gathering for the autumn raids across the western sea. Nothing that concerns us, friend. We are ghosts on this mountain, invisible to the world of men." Yet even as he spoke the words, Ulfarr felt a familiar ache in his chest, the longing for the fellowship of his brothers in arms, for the weight of a proper sword in his hand, for the thunder of hoofbeats and the clash of shield against shield. He had been Ulfarr the Bold once, son of Kettle the Red, Jarl of the western shores. His hall had been filled with light and laughter, his mead bench crowded with warriors eager to follow him into battle. That life seemed as distant now as the shores of Valhalla. Inside the cave, Ulfarr set about preparing their meal with the methodical care of a man who had learned to find meaning in simple tasks. He skinned the rabbits with swift, practiced strokes, saving the pelts to add to his growing collection. The meat went into an iron pot suspended over the fire, along with wild onions, bitter herbs, and water from the mountain spring. The aroma soon filled the cavern, rich and warming. Grayling settled beside the fire, but his attention remained fixed on Ulfar's movements. The wolf had shown remarkable restraint for a wild creature, never attempting to steal food, never showing aggression, always maintaining a respectful distance until invited closer. It was behavior more suited to a trained companion than a beast fresh from the wilderness. You know something of loyalty, don't you? Ulfarr mused as he stirred the stew. Perhaps that's why you stayed. You recognize a fellow exile when you see one. The memories came easier now, perhaps loosened by the simple act of sharing his thoughts with another living being. He remembered the day his exile began, the sound of his father's voice, heavy with disappointment and rage, as he pronounced the sentence. "No son of mine will bring such dishonor to our house." The words still carried the power to make Ulfar's massive hands tremble. It had started with a woman, as so many troubles did. Astrid, daughter of a rival Jarl, promised in marriage to seal an alliance between their clans. She had come to Ulfar's hall as tradition demanded, to be courted properly before the wedding. But somewhere between the formal exchanges of gifts and the careful negotiations of dowry, something genuine had blossomed between them. Something that went beyond political necessity. The betrayal, when it came, had shattered more than just Ulfar's heart. Astrid had fled in the night, taking with her not only the hopes for alliance, but also the sacred arm ring that had belonged to Ulfar's ancestors, a golden band inscribed with runes of protection and prosperity. Her disappearance had triggered a blood feud between the clans, one that had cost dozens of lives before it finally burned itself out. His father had given him a choice: pursue the woman and the stolen treasure, bringing back both or dying in the attempt, or accept exile and let the matter rest. Ulfarr had chosen the mountain, reasoning that enough blood had been spilled over his failures. The decision had saved lives, but it had also marked him as a coward in the eyes of many. 7 years, he said quietly, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. 7 years of wondering if I made the right choice. Grayling's response was to move closer, pressing his warm flank against Ulfar's leg. The simple gesture carried more comfort than any words might have. Together, they shared the evening meal in companionable silence, the firelight dancing across the rough walls of the cave and painting shifting shadows that seemed to hold memories of their own. As the flames died down to embers, Ulfarr wrapped himself in his exile cloak and prepared for sleep. Grayling curled up beside the dying fire, but his golden eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness beyond the cave entrance. It was then, in the last moments before sleep claimed him, that Ulfarr first noticed the strange quality of those eyes, not just their color, which was unusual enough, but the way they seemed to catch and hold the firelight long after the flames had dimmed. For just an instant, he could have sworn he saw something else reflected in those depths, symbols, perhaps, or markings that shifted and moved like living things. But exhaustion weighed heavy on his eyelids, and by morning he had convinced himself it was nothing more than a trick of the dying light. Outside, the wind sang its ancient song through the peaks of Svartafjall, carrying with it the scent of distant storms and the whispered promise that change was coming to the mountain. Whether its solitary guardian was ready or not, the storm came without warning on the 5th night, rolling across the peaks like an avalanche of wind and fury. Thunder shook the mountain to its bones, and lightning split the darkness with jagged silver scars. Inside his cave, Ulfarr sat beside the fire, mending a torn leather strap, while Grayling dozed fitfully nearby. The wolf had been restless all evening, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear, golden eyes flicking toward the cave entrance with increasing frequency. When the lightning struck closest, illuminating the cavern in stark white brilliance, Ulfarr saw it clearly for the first time. Grayling's eyes blazed with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected fire. Ancient symbols writhed and pulsed beneath the surface of those golden orbs, runes of power that Ulfarr recognized from the oldest stories. Though he had never expected to see them outside the realm of legend, the wolf's head snapped up, fixing Ulfarr with a gaze that held intelligence far beyond any earthly creature. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, man and beast stared at each other across the dancing flames. Then Grayling rose slowly to his feet, padding to the center of the cave where the firelight was strongest. What happened next defied every natural law Ulfarr had ever known. The wolf's wounds from the cliff rescue, scratches that should have taken weeks to heal, began to close before his eyes. The torn flesh knitted itself together with threads of golden light, leaving behind unmarked silver fur. Even more impossible, Ulfarr felt his own aches and pains, accumulated over decades of hard living, begin to fade as waves of healing energy washed over him. "By Thor's hammer," Ulfarr whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm's rage. "What are you, friend?" Grayling tilted his head, and for a moment Ulfarr could have sworn he saw the shadow of a smile cross the wolf's muzzle. Then the glow faded, the runes disappeared, and Grayling settled back beside the fire as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But the healing remained. Ulfar's arthritic joints moved without pain for the first time in years, and a deep cut on his hand from yesterday's hunting had vanished entirely. Sleep eluded him that night. He sat watching Grayling by the dying firelight, his mind racing with possibilities and implications. The old stories spoke of wolves touched by the gods, creatures that walked between the world of men and the realm of the divine. Fenrir himself had been such a beast, though his tale had ended in prophecy and doom. Could Grayling be kin to that legendary wolf? And if so, what did his presence on Svartafjall portend? Dawn brought an answer of sorts, though not one Ulfarr had expected. As the first pale light crept into the cave, a harsh cawing echoed from outside. Grayling's ears shot up, and he bounded toward the entrance with sudden urgency. Ulfarr followed more slowly, his massive frame blocking most of the cave mouth as he peered out into the morning light. A raven perched on the ledge outside, larger than any he had seen before. Its black feathers held an oily sheen that reflected the dawn, in shades of deep purple and midnight blue. Most unsettling of all, it clutched something in its talons, a smooth stone carved with intricate patterns. The raven's dark eyes fixed on Ulfarr with unmistakable intelligence before it dropped the stone and launched itself into the grey sky with powerful wing beats. Ulfarr retrieved the stone with trembling fingers. The message carved into its surface was brief but clear, written in the formal runic script used for matters of grave importance. The clans gather at Ironmoot. Your father's heir is challenged. The Wolfwalker brings omens of war. Come if you would see your bloodline survive. Bjorn Ironforge. The words hit Ulfarr like a physical blow. His father's heir, that would be his younger brother Magnus, who had assumed leadership of their clan after Ulfar's exile. Magnus was a good man but untested in the ways of war and politics. If someone was challenging his right to rule, it could only mean one thing. The old alliances were fracturing, and ambitious jarls were moving to expand their territories, but it was the reference to a wolf-walker that made Ulfar's blood run cold. Somehow, word of his bond with Grayling had already spread to the valleys below. In a world where superstition ran as deep as bedrock, a man who walked with wolves could be seen as either blessed by the gods or cursed by them. Given his family's current troubles, Ulfarr suspected most would assume the latter. "They know about you," he told Grayling, who had been watching the exchange with alert attention. "Somehow they already know. The wolf moved to stand beside him, pressing close against his leg in a gesture that had become familiar over their short time together. But now Ulfarr understood it differently, not just comfort, but partnership. Whatever Greyling truly was, wherever he had come from, their fates had become intertwined the moment Ulfarr had pulled him from that cliff. For 7 years, Ulfarr had lived as a ghost on the mountain, invisible to the world of men. He had found peace in that invisibility, or at least the absence of pain. But peace was a luxury he could no longer afford. His brother needed him, his clan faced destruction, and somewhere in the valleys below, whispers were spreading that would soon become shouts of fear and accusation. The practical part of his mind catalogued what he would need for the journey: weapons, provisions, warm clothing for the mountain passes. But another part, the part that had seen the runes blazing in Greyling's eyes, wondered what other changes this partnership might bring. The wolf had already demonstrated powers beyond mortal understanding. What else might be awakened as they descended from their mountain sanctuary into the turbulent world of men? As if sensing his thoughts, Greyling trotted to the back of the cave and began nosing at something hidden in the shadows. Ulfarr followed, curiosity overcoming his brooding concerns. The wolf had uncovered an old travel pack, one Ulfarr hadn't touched since his first year of exile. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay the tools of his former life: a war axe with a silver-inlaid blade, chainmail that still gleamed despite years of neglect, and a silver arm ring bearing his family's mark, everything he would need to reclaim his place in the world of men. "Clever friend," Ulfarr murmured, running his fingers over the familiar weight of the axe. "Did you know this day would come? Is that why you stayed?" Greyling's only answer was to meet his gaze steadily, those golden eyes holding depths of knowledge that seemed ancient beyond measure. Whatever the wolf's true nature, whatever powers he possessed, one thing was certain: their quiet life on Svartalfjall was ending. The raven's message had seen to that. As Ulfarr began to prepare for the journey that would take them back into the world he had fled, he couldn't shake the feeling that saving Greyling from the cliff had been more than an act of compassion. It had been the first move in a game whose rules he didn't yet understand, played by powers far greater than any mortal man. The only question now was whether that game would end in redemption or ruin for them both. The journey down from Svartalfjall began at dawn. 3 days after the raven's arrival, Ulfarr had spent the intervening time preparing both his gear and his mind for the world he was about to re-enter. His war axe hung at his side, its familiar weight a comfort after years of carrying only hunting knives. The chainmail lay folded in his pack alongside provisions for the long road ahead: dried meat, hard bread, and a small pouch of silver coins he had saved from his exile's sparse needs. Greyling moved beside him with fluid grace, navigating the treacherous mountain paths as if he had traveled them 1,000 times before. The wolf's supernatural healing abilities had become more apparent over the past few days. When Ulfarr had accidentally cut himself while sharpening his axe, Greyling had simply touched the wound with his nose, and the bleeding had stopped instantly. More unsettling still were the moments when the wolf seemed to understand not just Ulfar's words, but his unspoken thoughts as well. "The first test will be at Raven's Rest," Ulfarr explained, as they picked their way down a narrow ledge that skirted a deep ravine. His breath misted in the cold morning air, and frost crunched beneath their feet. "Old Gunnar keeps the inn there. He knew me before the exile. If anyone will recognize me, it will be him." Greyling's ears swiveled toward him, and Ulfarr caught a glimpse of those golden eyes. For just a moment, he saw concern there. Not the simple alertness of an animal, but genuine worry. The wolf understood the danger they faced. In a world where reputation meant everything, Ulfar's return would be seen as either a blessing or a curse, depending on how the wind was blowing. The morning sun climbed higher as they descended, warming the air and melting the frost from the rocks. Gradually, the sparse vegetation of the high peaks gave way to hardy shrubs and scattered pine trees. Ulfarr felt each step taking him further from the peace he had known and closer to the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined the world below. It was near midday when they encountered their first sign of trouble. Grayling suddenly froze, hackles rising as he stared down the path ahead. Ulfarr followed his gaze and spotted movement among the trees. 3 figures crouched behind fallen logs, clearly positioned to ambush unwary travelers. Bandits most likely, or perhaps deserters, from one of the many feuds that plagued the region. "Can you sense them?" Ulfarr whispered, drawing his axe with practiced silence.
How many?
As if in answer, Grayling padded forward a few steps and tilted his head, listening intently. Then he held up one paw, then another, then a third and fourth. 4 enemies, then. Ulfarr nodded grimly. The wolf's senses extended far beyond those of any normal creature. The ambush, when it came, was clumsy and desperate. The bandits emerged from cover too early, their hunger for easy prey overriding their caution. They saw a lone traveler with a fine axe and warm cloak, exactly the sort of victim they had been hoping for. What they didn't account for was Ulfar's size and skill, or his unusual companion. The first bandit died before he could properly raise his sword, Ulfar's axe taking him in the chest with a wet thud. The second managed to engage for a few heartbeats, his blade ringing against Ulfar's in a brief dance of steel before a backhand stroke opened his throat. The third tried to flee, but Grayling was on him in 3 bounds, powerful jaws clamping down on the man's sword arm and dragging him to the ground. The 4th bandit, a grizzled veteran with scars crisscrossing his face, had the wisdom to drop his weapon and raise his hands in surrender. "Mercy, Lord," he gasped, his eyes darting between Ulfar's bloodied axe and Grayling's bared fangs. "We thought you were just another merchant. We didn't know what." Ulfar's voice carried the authority of a man born to command, even after 7 years of exile. "The wolf," the bandit whispered. "The stories are true. You really are the wolf walker they speak of." Ulfar's blood chilled. If word had spread this far already, then his return would be anything but secret. "What stories? Who speaks of a wolf walker?" The bandit licked his lips nervously, glancing again at Grayling, who had released his fallen victim but remained poised to strike. "The scalds in the taverns, Lord. They say a giant walks with Fenrir's kin in the high places. They say he brings omens of the twilight, that the old gods stir again in the north." The words hit Ulfarr like physical blows. Fenrir's kin, the twilight of the gods. These were not casual superstitions, but references to the most fundamental fears of his people. In Norse belief, Fenrir the wolf would one day break free from his divine bonds and devour Odin himself, triggering the end of all things. If people were comparing Grayling to that legendary beast, "Let me live, Lord," the bandit pleaded. "I have children in the valley below. I'll speak no word of seeing you here." Ulfarr studied the man's face, seeing genuine fear, but also the desperate cunning of someone who would say anything to survive. Beside him, Grayling whined softly, not a sound of distress, but something almost like a suggestion. When Ulfarr looked down, he found the wolf watching him with those knowing golden eyes. "Your name?" Ulfarr demanded. "Eric Halfnose, Lord. Folk call me that on account of—" The man gestured to his mangled face, where an old wound had indeed taken half his nose. "Eric Halfnose, hear me well. You will indeed speak no word of this encounter, but not because I spare your life." Ulfarr hefted his axe meaningfully. "You will keep silent because I offer you something better than mercy. Take word to Raven's Rest. Tell Gunnar that an old friend comes seeking shelter. Tell him the exile returns, but make no mention of my companion. Do this, and I will see that your children have silver enough to last the winter." The bandit's eyes widened. Silver was precious enough, but the promise of winter security was beyond price. "It shall be done, Lord. You have my oath. See that you keep it." Oathbreakers fare poorly in my memory. Eric gathered his scattered gear and hurried down the mountain path, casting fearful glances back at Grayling, until he disappeared around a bend. Ulfarr cleaned his axe on the cloak of one of the dead bandits, his mind troubled by what he had learned. If the stories had already begun, if people were already connecting Grayling to the darkest prophecies of their faith, then their journey would be far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "Come," Friend, he said to Grayling as they resumed their descent, we have a reputation to outrun and a brother to save. Let us hope we can accomplish both before the stories grow too large to contain. The wolf fell into step beside him, and together they continued down the mountain toward whatever fate awaited them in the valleys below. Raven's Rest perched on a rocky outcrop where three mountain paths converged, its timber walls and slate roof weathered by countless storms, but still standing strong after decades of service. Smoke rose from its central chimney, carrying the familiar sense of roasting meat and fermented grain that promised warmth and sustenance to weary travelers. As Ulfarr and Grayling approached the inn's heavy oak door, the murmur of voices from within grew audible, the comfortable sound of people sharing tales and drink at the end of a long day. Ulfarr paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the door's iron latch. 7 years ago he had passed through this very door as a welcome guest, his name spoken with respect and his silver accepted gladly. Now he returned as an exile, accompanied by a creature that inspired fear in the hearts of common folk. The weight of his exile cloak seemed heavier on his shoulders as he considered what awaited him inside. Stay close, he murmured to Grayling. These are not bandits we can simply fight our way past. These are honest folk with honest fears. The wolf's response was to press against his leg in that gesture of solidarity that had become their unspoken language. Together, they pushed through the door and entered the warm, amber-lit common room of Raven's Rest. Conversation died the moment they crossed the threshold. A dozen faces turned toward them, expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition, to something approaching terror as they took in the sight of the massive Viking and his unusual companion. Ulfar's eyes swept the room, cataloguing familiar faces aged by the years of his absence. Merchants, trappers, a few soldiers bearing the colors of minor jarls, all united now in their stunned silence. Behind the bar, Gunnar Ironbeard stood frozen with a clay mug half-filled in his hands. The innkeeper had aged considerably since Ulfarr last saw him, his famous iron-grey beard now streaked with white, his broad shoulders slightly stooped. But his eyes remained sharp as they fixed on his unexpected guest. Ulfarr Ketilsson, Gunnar said finally, his voice carrying across the silent room like the crack of breaking ice. 7 winters it's been. 7 long winters, old friend, Ulfarr replied, stepping further into the room. Grayling moved with him, never more than an arm's length away, golden eyes scanning the assembled crowd with alert intelligence. I had hoped to find you well as any man can be in these troubled times. Gunnar's gaze shifted to Grayling, and Ulfarr saw him swallow hard. I received word that you might be coming, though the messenger said nothing about... He gestured toward the wolf. This is Grayling, Ulfarr said simply. He travels with me now. A bearded trapper near the fire crossed himself with trembling fingers. By Thor's beard, he whispered. It's true then. The wolf walker has come down from the mountain. The words rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Several patrons rose from their seats, hands moving instinctively toward weapon hilts. Others pressed themselves back against the walls, as if proximity to Ulfarr and his companion might bring some terrible curse upon them. Peace, Gunnar said loudly, raising his hands. This is still my house, and all who enter seek shelter under the old laws. Ulfarr Ketilsson was once counted among the greatest of our warriors. Whatever tales you may have heard, he will have guessed right here. An older woman with silver braids spoke up from her corner table. What tales would those be, Gunnar? That he consorts with demons? That he brings the end times with him wherever he walks? Her voice carried the authority of a seeress, someone whose words carried weight in the community. Look at that creature's eyes. Tell me you don't see the fire of other worlds burning there? All eyes turned to Grayling, who bore the scrutiny with remarkable calm. In the flickering firelight, his golden eyes did indeed seem to hold an inner radiance that had nothing to do with reflected flame. For a heartbeat, Ulfarr thought he caught a glimpse of those mysterious runes stirring in their depths, but the wolf blinked, and the moment passed. I see a loyal companion, Ulfarr said firmly. One who has shown me more faithfulness than many men I've known. "Aye," said a voice from near the door. "And what manner of loyalty might that be?" Ulfarr turned to see a young warrior in fine mail, bearing the raven and sword device of the Ironforge clan. This would be one of his old friend Bjorn's men, perhaps even his son, judging by the resemblance. The young man's hand rested casually on his sword hilt, though he made no overtly threatening moves. "The loyalty of one who asks nothing and gives everything," Ulfarr replied. "The kind that perhaps grows rarer with each passing year." "Pretty words," the warrior said. "But words won't explain why every skald from here to the western sea speaks of omens and portents. They say the old gods stir in their halls. They say Fenrir's children walk the earth again, preparing the way for the wolf winter that comes before the end of all things." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. These were not casual superstitions being voiced, but the deepest fears of a people who lived always in the shadow of prophecy. The Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was not some distant threat to these folk, but an inevitable doom that colored every aspect of their lives. Grayling suddenly rose from his position beside Ulfar's leg and padded toward the common room's central fire. The assembled patrons shrank back as he passed, but the wolf paid them no attention. Instead, he settled himself near the flames and began what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary grooming routine. Licking his paws and washing his face with the casual indifference of any domestic animal. The mundane nature of the action broke some of the tension. A few nervous chuckles arose from the crowd, and Ulfarr sensed the moment to press his advantage. "Does that look like a harbinger of doom to you?" he asked, gesturing toward Grayling's prosaic ablutions. "He sheds. He tracks mud into dwelling places, and he has an unfortunate tendency to steal food when he thinks I'm not watching. If he's a demon, he's remarkably concerned with personal hygiene." More laughter followed, and Ulfarr felt the room's mood beginning to shift. Fear remained, but it was tempered now by curiosity and the simple human tendency to find comfort in the familiar. Gunnar seized the moment to step forward with a clay mug filled with ale. "Drink," the innkeeper said firmly. "You've come far and the night grows cold. Whatever troubles follow you, they can wait until morning." Ulfarr accepted the mug gratefully, feeling the warm ale wash away some of the road's dust and weariness. Around him, conversation gradually resumed, though he remained the focus of many sidelong glances. The immediate crisis had passed, but he knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the stories about the Wolfwalker would only grow with each telling. For now, though, he had shelter and warmth. It was enough. The night at Raven's Rest passed uneasily. Ulfarr had been given a small chamber on the inn's upper floor, little more than a closet, with a straw mattress and a narrow window that looked out over the mountain paths. Grayling had settled on the floor beside the bed, but his sleep was restless, punctuated by soft whines and the occasional low growl that suggested his dreams were troubled by more than ordinary wolf concerns. It was near midnight when Ulfarr was awakened by voices drifting up from the common room below. The inn should have been quiet at this hour, but several patrons had lingered long past the usual closing time, their conversation fueled by strong drink and stronger fears. Through the thin wooden floor their words came clearly enough to make out individual speakers. "Saw it with my own eyes," the seeress was saying, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being believed. The beast's eyes blazed like forge fire when the light caught them just so. "That's no natural wolf, mark my words. Natural or not," came the voice of the young Ironforge warrior. "He bears watching. My father sent me to observe, not to act. But if the exiled proves to be what the stories claim, what stories?" This from Gunnar, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The one spreading through every hall from here to the coast. "They say Ulfarr Ketilsson made a pact with dark powers during his exile. That the wolf is his familiar, sent by Loki himself to prepare the way for the final battle. Some even claim the beast can speak, that it whispers secrets in the old tongue when the moon is dark." Ulfarr felt Grayling stir beside him, the wolf's ears pricking up at the mention of his name. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, Those golden eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light, though whether that was supernatural fire or simply the play of silver radiance on reflective surfaces, Ulfarr could no longer say with certainty. Foolishness, Gunnar's voice carried up from below, though it lacked conviction. I've known Ulfarr since he was a boy. He's no more in league with trickster gods than I am. Perhaps not by choice, the seeress replied. But the exile changes a man. 7 years alone on that cursed mountain, with only the wind and ravens for company. Who knows what bargains he might have made to ease his solitude? The conversation continued, but Ulfarr had heard enough. He rose quietly from his bed and moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape that rolled away toward the valleys below. In the distance, he could see the occasional glimmer of firelight marking villages and settlements, the world of men that he had left behind and must now re-enter. Grayling joined him at the window, pressing close against his leg in that familiar gesture of companionship. The wolf's presence was a comfort, but it was also a burden. Every step of their journey would be shadowed by suspicion and fear, every action interpreted through the lens of ancient prophecy and superstition. "What are you really?" Ulfarr whispered, his breath fogging the cold glass. "And what have you brought into my life?" As if in answer, Grayling's eyes began to glow more brightly. And suddenly, Ulfarr could see images forming in their golden depths, not the mysterious runes he had glimpsed before, but clear visions that played out like memories from some other life. He saw a great hall filled with warriors, their faces painted with unfamiliar designs and their weapons gleaming with silver inlay. At the high table sat a figure he recognized with a shock. Himself, but younger, dressed in the rich furs and gold arm rings of a powerful jarl. Beside him sat a woman of extraordinary beauty, her golden hair braided with precious stones, and her eyes the same impossible shade of gold as Grayling's own. The vision shifted, showing the same hall in ruins, its roof timbers blackened by fire and its great stones scattered by some tremendous force. Bodies lay among the wreckage, and over it all circled ravens so numerous they blotted out the sun. But in the center of the destruction, where the high table had once stood, a single figure remained, the golden-eyed woman, but transformed into something both terrible and magnificent. When the images faded, Ulfarr found himself staring into Grayling's normal eyes once more, though his heart pounded with the intensity of what he had seen. The visions had carried the weight of memory, as if they were not prophecy but recollection, glimpses of events that had already come to pass in some distant time or place. "Astrid," he breathed, the name escaping his lips before he could stop it. The woman in the vision had borne little resemblance to the Jarl's daughter he had once loved, but something in her face, something in the way she carried herself, had been unmistakably familiar. Grayling whined softly, a sound that carried notes of both sorrow and warning. Whatever the visions meant, whatever connection they revealed between his past and present, one thing was becoming clear. His exile and Grayling's appearance were not the separate events he had assumed them to be. They were part of something larger, a pattern that stretched back through years and perhaps across lifetimes. From below, the voices had grown quieter, but their words continued to drift upward like smoke from a dying fire. Plans were being made, messages discussed that would be carried to various jarls and clan leaders. The young Ironforge warrior spoke of his father's concerns about the approaching moot, where the succession of Ulfar's brother would be decided. Other voices mentioned strange omens, ravens gathering in unprecedented numbers, wolves singing in the deep forests where none had been seen for generations, and dreams that came to seers across the Northlands with disturbing consistency, all of it centered on the return of the Wolfwalker, the exile who had come down from his mountain, accompanied by a creature that defied natural law. Whether they knew it or not, the people below were already weaving the threads of legend around Ulfarr and Grayling, creating a story that would take on a life of its own, regardless of the truth behind it. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Ulfarr made his decision. They would leave Raven's Rest before the inn fully awakened, striking out for the coast and the great moot where his brother's fate would be decided. The whispers would follow them wherever they went, but perhaps in the chaos of political maneuvering and clan rivalries, the truth might have a chance to emerge, or perhaps the legends were truer than he wanted to believe. And the wolf at his side really was a harbinger of changes that would reshape the world of the North forever. Only time would tell which story would prove to be the real one. They departed. Raven's Rest in the pale light of dawn, while mist still clung to the mountain paths and the inn's other guests remained abed. Gunnar had pressed a leather pouch of provisions into Ulfar's hands at the door, along with words of warning spoken in hushed tones that betrayed the innkeeper's genuine concern. "The roads grow dangerous." "Old friend," Gunnar had whispered, glancing nervously at Grayling, who waited patiently in the pre-dawn shadows. "Word of your return has spread faster than wildfire. Some will welcome you as a returning hero, but others—" he shook his grizzled head. "Others remember only the exile and the stories that have grown around it. Trust few and sleep with one eye open." Now, 3 hours into their journey, Ulfarr reflected on those words as he and Grayling made their way along the ancient trade road that wound through the forests toward the coast. The path was well-traveled, but showed signs of recent trouble. Broken cartwheels abandoned beside the road, ash circles where camps had been hastily abandoned, and the occasional dark stain on stone that spoke of violence done in these supposedly peaceful woods. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full glory of the autumn landscape. Golden birches stood like torches among the darker evergreens, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant snow. Under other circumstances, it would have been a beautiful day for travel. But Grayling's constant alertness, ears swiveling at every sound, nostrils testing the wind for unfamiliar scents, reminded Ulfarr that they were far from safe. It was near midday when they encountered the first sign of organized pursuit. Grayling suddenly stopped dead in the middle of the path, hackles rising as he stared back the way they had come. Ulfarr followed his gaze and spotted movement among the trees, mounted figures maintaining their distance but clearly following their trail. "How many?" Ulfarr asked quietly, though he was still learning to interpret the wolf's silent communications. Grayling's response was to pad to the edge of the path and scratch a series of marks in the dirt. 5 distinct grooves, followed by a pause, then 3 more. 8 riders then, traveling in 2 groups. Professional pursuit, not the random banditry they had encountered on the mountain. Bjorn's men, most likely, Ulfarr mused aloud. "Come to escort us the rest of the way to Ironmoot, or to ensure we don't arrive at all, depending on how the political winds are blowing." They continued along the path, but Ulfar's hand never strayed far from his axe hilt. The riders maintained their distance, content for now to observe rather than engage. It was a familiar tactic from his days as a war leader. Gather intelligence first, strike only when the odds were overwhelmingly in your favor. The road began to descend as they entered the coastal lowlands, winding between stands of ancient oak and ash that had stood since the time of the first kings. Here and there, standing stones marked crossroads or burial sites, their carved surfaces weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain. At one such crossroads, Grayling paused beside a particularly massive stone. Sniffing at its base with unusual interest, Ulfarr approached to see what had caught the wolf's attention and found fresh offerings placed at the stone's base. Bread, mead, and silver coins left by travelers seeking the favor of whatever spirits dwelt in this place. But among the traditional offerings lay something that made his blood run cold, a wolf's pelt, still fresh, with the creature's head intact and positioned to stare eternally skyward with glassy eyes. "A warning," Ulfarr said grimly. "Or perhaps a threat." Grayling's response was to throw back his head and loose a long, mournful howl that echoed through the forest like the voice of winter itself. The sound carried notes of grief and rage that seemed to resonate in Ulfar's very bones, and when it finally faded, The surrounding woods had fallen into an unnatural silence. From somewhere behind them came the sound of horses, neighing in distress and men shouting in alarm. Their pursuers had heard that howl and found it as unsettling as any mortal man would. Ulfarr almost smiled at the irony. Greyling's grief for his fallen kin had accomplished what violence could not, driving back their watchers through the simple power of primal fear. They pressed on through the afternoon, the road gradually widening as they approached more populated areas. Farmsteads appeared among the trees, their fields brown with harvest stubble, and their chimneys sending lazy spirals of smoke into the clear sky. But something was wrong with the pastoral scene. Too many fields lay fallow, too many homesteads showed signs of hasty abandonment. Windows were shuttered, livestock pens stood empty, and the few people they glimpsed in the distance hurried quickly indoors at the sight of travelers on the road. War preparation. Ulfarr observed as they passed a prosperous-looking farm whose gates had been reinforced with fresh timber and iron. The clans are gathering for more than just a succession moot. Someone expects fighting. As if summoned by his words, a group of warriors emerged from the farm's courtyard, 20 strong, and bearing the blue and silver colors of Clan Ravencrest. Their leader, a grizzled veteran with a magnificent beard braided with silver rings, rode forward to block the road. "Hold there. Travelers," the warrior called, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "State your business in these lands, and know that we suffer no brigands or oath-breakers to pass." Ulfarr drew himself up to his full, impressive height, letting his exile cloak fall back to reveal the quality of his armor and weapons. "I am Ulfarr Kettleson, son of Ketil the Red, and I travel to Ironmoot on urgent business." "Stand aside, Eric Ravencrest, before you do something your father would regret." The recognition in the warrior's eyes was immediate and profound. Eric Ravencrest had served under Ulfar's command in the raids against the Saxon shores, and the memory of those battles was written clearly on his weathered face. But with recognition came something else, a fear that had nothing to do with personal combat and everything to do with the wolf standing silent at Ulfar's side. "Ulfarr the Bold," Eric said slowly, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and unease. 7 years we've heard nothing, and now you return in such company." His gaze fixed on Greyling, who met it steadily with those unsettling golden eyes. The Skalds say many things," Ulfarr interrupted, "most of them worth less than morning mist. Will you bar the road to an old comrade, Eric? Or will you remember the oath you swore when we fought together in the shield wall?" For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the space of years and changing loyalties. Then Eric slowly moved his horse aside, though his hand remained near his weapon. "Pass, Wolfwalker," he said, using the title that had already begun to replace Ulfar's birth name in the minds of men. "But know that the moot is no place for legends and omens. Practical men are making practical decisions about the future of the Northlands. Your brother Magnus fights for his inheritance against challengers who claim the old blood has grown weak. And what do you believe, old friend?" Eric's smile was grim as winter ice. "I believe the world is changing whether we will it or not. The only question is whether we change with it or are swept away by forces beyond our understanding." With that cryptic pronouncement, he wheeled his horse around and led his men back toward the farmstead, leaving the road clear for Ulfarr and Greyling to continue their journey. But as they walked away, Ulfarr could feel 20 pairs of eyes watching their retreat, and he knew that word of their encounter would race ahead of them to Ironmoot faster than any horse could carry it. The legends were growing with each mile they traveled, and soon they would have a momentum that no mortal man could hope to control. The coastal village of Saltmere appeared through the morning fog like a memory half remembered. Its harbour bristled with the masts of longships and trading vessels, while smoke from 100 hearth-fires created a haze that hung over the wooden buildings clustered along the shoreline. Ulfarr had expected to feel some stirring of homecoming at the sight. This had been his people's principal port, the place where he had first learned to handle a sword and command men. Instead, he felt only a hollow ache, as if he were viewing the remnants of a life that had belonged to someone else entirely. Grayling pressed close against his leg as they approached the village outskirts, the wolf's golden eyes alert to the many scents and sounds of human habitation. Dogs began barking as they drew near, setting up a chorus of alarm that brought curious faces to windows and doorways. But it was Grayling's reaction that caught Ulfar's attention. The wolf had gone rigid, hackles rising as he stared toward the harbour with unmistakable recognition. Following his companion's gaze, Ulfarr spotted what had captured the wolf's attention. Moored at the end of the longest pier sat a ship unlike any other in the harbour, sleek and black-hulled, with a carved dragon's head that seemed to watch the approaching travellers with jewelled eyes. Even from this distance, Ulfarr could see the quality of its construction, the silver inlays that caught the morning sun, and most telling of all, the standard flying from its mast, the raven and golden wolf of Clan Goldmane, Astrid's family crest. Impossible, Ulfarr breathed. But even as he spoke the word, he knew it was true. Astrid had returned to these waters after 7 years of absence, and her timing was far too convenient to be mere coincidence. The woman who had stolen his family's sacred armouring and fled into the night had somehow learned of his emergence from exile and come to meet him. As if sensing his thoughts, Grayling let out a low whine, not of fear but of something deeper and more complex. The wolf's reaction suggested recognition, but how could a creature he had found dying on a mountain cliff know anything of Astrid Goldmane? The answer came as they drew closer to the village proper, and Ulfarr caught sight of a figure standing on the black ship's deck. Even across the distance, even after 7 years, he knew that silhouette. The graceful curve of her neck, the way she held her shoulders, the golden hair that caught the light like spun sunbeams. But there was something different about her now, something in her bearing that spoke of power gained and prices paid. She turned toward them as if she had felt his gaze, and even from 100 yards away, Ulfarr could see her eyes. They blazed with the same impossible golden fire that burned in Grayling's own gaze. And in that moment, the last pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known he was solving fell into place. "By all the gods," he whispered, "what have you become?" Grayling's response was to push forward, no longer content to match Ulfar's measured pace. The wolf bounded toward the harbour with obvious eagerness, leaving Ulfarr to follow in his wake as curious villagers scattered from their path. By the time they reached the pier, a small crowd had gathered to witness the reunion between the exile, his supernatural companion, and the mysterious woman whose ship had arrived just hours before dawn. Astrid stood waiting at the gangplank, and Ulfar's breath caught in his throat as he saw her clearly for the first time in 7 years. She had always been beautiful, but now she possessed an otherworldly quality that made it difficult to look directly at her for long. Her golden hair seemed to move with a life of its own, stirring in breezes that touched nothing else, and her skin held a luminous quality that suggested she was lit from within by some inner fire. But it was her eyes that held him transfixed, those same golden orbs that stared at him from Grayling's lupine face. Filled with ancient knowledge and terrible sorrow, "Hello, Ulfarr," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the water despite being barely above a whisper. "I told you we would meet again." Grayling reached the gangplank first, bounding up onto the ship's deck without hesitation. But instead of greeting Astrid as a stranger, the wolf did something that made Ulfar's world tilt sideways. He began to shimmer and blur, his form wavering like heat haze above summer stones. Before the watching crowd's astonished eyes, the wolf's shape stretched and changed, silver fur becoming golden hair, forelegs becoming 2. Lupine features reshaping themselves into the face of a young woman with eyes like molten gold. A second, Astrid stood on the ship's deck, identical to the first in every detail save one, where the first wore rich robes befitting a jarl's daughter. This second figure was clad in simple travelling clothes, her feet bare and her hair unbound. The two women regarded each other with expressions of infinite sadness, as if they were looking into a mirror that reflected not their appearance, but their souls. "My sister," the first Astrid said softly. "My other self. Thank you for watching over him." The second Astrid, the one Ulfarr had known as Grayling, nodded slowly. "The binding weakens. Soon there will be only one of us again." "Soon," the first agreed. "But not yet. There is still work to be done." Ulfarr found his voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a croak. "What witchcraft is this? What are you?" Both women turned to face him, and speaking in perfect unison, they gave him an answer that explained everything and nothing at all. "We are what we were made to be when we stole your family's arm ring 7 years ago. We are the price of trying to change fate itself." The first Astrid stepped forward, producing from beneath her robes a familiar golden band inscribed with protective runes. Ulfar's family arm ring, the treasure she had stolen on the night of her flight, gleamed with the same inner light that seemed to suffuse everything connected to this impossible reunion. "This is no mere ornament," she continued, her voice heavy with regret. "It is a prison, forged by your ancestors to bind a power too dangerous to be left free in the world. When I took it, I thought I was claiming a prize worthy of my sacrifice. Instead, I became the very thing it was meant to contain." The crowd of villagers had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of magical transformation and the reunion of legendary figures. Ulfarr could hear whispers spreading through their ranks, words like shapeshifter and sorceress and harbinger of the end times. The fear that had followed him down from the mountain was nothing compared to what was building here on this dock. "The arm ring split my soul," Astrid explained, seemingly oblivious to the growing crowd. "One half remained human, trapped in this form, and cursed to wander the seas in search of redemption. The other became the wolf you saved from the cliff, your faithful Grayling, bound to you by magic stronger than any chain." "But why?" Ulfarr demanded. "Why reveal this now? Why return at all?" The answer came not from either Astrid, but from a new voice, harsh and commanding, cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. Ulfarr turned to see a figure striding down the pier toward them, flanked by armed warriors bearing the wolf-head banner of Clan Bloodfang. Ragnar the Red had always been a large man, but the years had made him massive, not with fat, but with the kind of solid muscle that spoke of constant warfare and physical struggle. His red beard was shot through with grey now, and his face bore new scars. But his pale blue eyes burned with the same ambition that had driven him to challenge kings and conquer kingdoms. "Because, old friend," Ragnar called out as he approached, his voice carrying easily to every ear on the dock, "the time has come for the old bloodlines to prove their worth, or step aside for those with the strength to lead the Northlands into a new age." Behind him, more warriors emerged from the village streets, dozens of them, all bearing the colors of different clans, but united under Ragnar's leadership. The political situation became clear in an instant. This was not just a succession moot they were sailing toward, but a carefully orchestrated coup, and somehow Ulfar's return with his supernatural companion had become the catalyst that would determine whether the old order survived or fell to Ragnar's ambitions. The wolf winter was beginning, just as the prophecies had foretold. The great moot ground of Ironmoot stretched across a natural amphitheater carved by glaciers in the age of ice, its stone circle older than memory and sacred to every clan in the Northlands. As Ulfar's ship approached the harbour, he could see the evidence of gathering power spread across the surrounding hills. Hundreds of ships drawn up on the beaches, thousands of warriors camped in ordered rows, and the smoke of countless fires rising into the grey autumn sky. 3 days had passed since the revelation at Saltmere. 3 days during which Ulfarr had struggled to comprehend the true scope of what was unfolding around him. Astrid, both versions of her, had explained the curse's nature during their voyage north. The arm ring his ancestors had forged was indeed a prison, designed to contain a fragment of divine power stolen from the gods themselves during the earliest days of the world, when she had taken it in her desperate flight from an unwanted marriage. The artifact had recognized her magical bloodline and bound itself to her soul, splitting her essence between human and wolf forms as punishment for her theft. The binding weakens. With each passing moon, the human Astrid had told him as they sailed through waters grown dark with storm clouds, soon one of us must die for the other to live whole. The question is, which one fate will choose to preserve? Her wolf sister had said nothing during these conversations, but Ulfarr had caught her watching him with those golden eyes, and he thought he detected a sadness there that went beyond the tragedy of her cursed existence. She knew, perhaps better than any of them, that their reunion would soon become a final parting. Now, as their ship entered the harbour of Ironmoot, the full magnitude of Ragnar's preparations became apparent. This was not a gathering for a simple succession ceremony, but a war moot, the kind of assembly that had not been called since the days of the first kings. Every major clan was represented here, but their traditional camps had been subtly arranged to create two distinct factions. On the eastern shore stood the banners of the Old Blood, families whose lineages stretched back to the legendary heroes of the earliest sagas. On the western shore flew the colors of newer powers, clans that had risen through conquest and cunning rather than ancient birthright. Between them, on the moot ground itself, stood a single pavilion of black silk that bore no clan markers at all. Ragnar's command center, positioned where he could watch both factions and remind everyone present that he stood above their petty divisions. "He's been planning this for years," Astrid murmured as they disembarked. Around them, dock workers and merchants went about their business with the forced normalcy of people trying to ignore the storm gathering overhead. The succession crisis was just an excuse to call a moot. Once all the clans are gathered in one place, he'll force a vote on high kingship, Ulfarr finished grimly. With his supporters already in position and his enemies outnumbered, he'll claim the right to rule all the Northlands by acclamation, unless someone challenges his authority, the wolf Astrid said softly. She had retained human form since the transformation at Saltmere, but her voice still carried undertones that reminded Ulfarr of wind through mountain passes. Unless the Old Blood proves it still carries power worth respecting. They were met at the harbour by a delegation led by Bjorn Ironforge, Ulfar's oldest friend and the man whose message had drawn him down from the mountain. Bjorn had aged well, his iron-grey hair still thick and his sword arm steady, but his weathered face showed the strain of trying to hold the traditional clans together in the face of Ragnar's growing influence. "Ulfarr," Bjorn said simply, clasping his friend's arm in the old style. 7 years is too long between meetings." "Too long indeed," Ulfarr replied, noting how Bjorn's escort, all young warriors he didn't recognize, kept their hands near their weapons and their eyes fixed on the two Astrids. "I trust my brother fares well." Bjorn's expression darkened. "Magnus does what he can, but the challenges mount daily. Ragnar's supporters question every decision, demand proof of worthiness for every traditional privilege. They say the Old Blood has grown weak, that fresh leadership is needed for fresh times." As they spoke, a commotion arose from the direction of the moot ground. Horns were sounding the call for assembly, their bronze voices echoing across the water with urgent summons. Whatever Ragnar had planned, it was beginning ahead of schedule. "The bastard couldn't wait for the traditional ceremonies," Bjorn spat. "He's forcing the succession vote today, while half the eastern clans are still arriving." They hurried toward the great circle, joining streams of warriors and clan leaders converging on the ancient meeting ground. The stone seats that ringed the amphitheatre were filling rapidly, but Ulfarr noticed how the seating arrangements had been subtly managed. Ragnar's supporters occupied the prime positions closest to the speaking stone, while representatives of the old families found themselves relegated to the higher, more distant tiers. At the center of it all stood Magnus, Ulfar's younger brother, looking desperately outnumbered as he faced a semicircle of challengers. Magnus had inherited their father's height, but not his commanding presence, where Ketil the Red had been a force of nature. Magnus appeared thoughtful and scholarly, better suited to managing harvests than leading raids. The contrast was not lost on the assembled crowd, many of whom whispered among themselves about the weakness of the current bloodline. Ragnar himself stood slightly apart from the challengers, his position chosen to suggest that he was above the petty squabbling over minor leadership roles. His pale eyes scanned the crowd with the calculating gaze of a predator, noting allies and enemies with equal attention. When his gaze fell upon Ulfarr and his unusual companions, Ragnar's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Brothers and sisters of the Northlands," Ragnar's voice boomed across the amphitheater, cutting through the murmur of conversation with practiced authority. "We gather today not for mere ceremony, but to determine the future of our people. For too long, we have been led by those who claim authority through accident of birth rather than proof of worthiness. For too long, we have followed traditions that serve the past rather than embrace the possibilities of tomorrow." A cheer arose from his supporters, carefully orchestrated to suggest widespread approval. But Ulfarr noticed how many of the older clan leaders remained silent, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were witnessing the attempted overthrow of everything their ancestors had built. "I do not seek to destroy our heritage," Ragnar continued, his tone becoming more reasonable, more persuasive. "Rather, I propose to strengthen it by ensuring that leadership goes to those who have proven themselves in battle, in wisdom, and in the favor of the gods themselves." At this, his gaze fixed unmistakably on Ulfarr, and the crowd began to turn and stare. Whispers spread like ripples in still water. The wolf walker had come, the exile had returned. The legends were walking among them in flesh and blood. "Indeed," Ragnar said, his voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the amphitheater. "It seems the gods themselves have sent us a sign. Ulfarr Ketilsson, the exile who was cast out for bringing dishonor to his bloodline, now returns with companions that defy natural law. Some might call this a blessing. Others might see it as the final proof that the old blood has been corrupted beyond redemption." The crowd's murmur grew louder, more agitated. Ulfarr could feel the mood shifting, see how Ragnar's words were being received by different factions. The man was a master of manipulation, turning even Ulfar's presence into evidence for his argument. "But I say," Ragnar continued, raising his voice to overcome the growing noise, "let the exile speak for himself. Let him tell us what bargains he made during his years in the wilderness. Let him explain the nature of his supernatural companions and the omens they carry. Let him prove, here before all our people, whether his return brings blessing or curse to the Northlands." The challenge hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Ragnar had maneuvered the situation perfectly. Whatever Ulfarr said now would be used as evidence either for or against the old bloodlines. If he admitted to the supernatural nature of his bond with Astrid, he would confirm the fears about corrupted nobility. If he denied it, he would be branded a liar before an assembly that had already witnessed the wolf's transformation. Magnus caught his brother's eye across the amphitheater, and Ulfarr saw both hope and desperation in that gaze. His younger brother was depending on him to find a way through this verbal maze, to turn Ragnar's trap into an opportunity for truth. But as Ulfarr rose to respond, both versions of Astrid placed restraining hands on his arms. "Wait," the human Astrid whispered urgently. "There's something you need to know first. Something about why Ragnar really wants you to speak." Her wolf sister nodded gravely. "He doesn't fear your words, Ulfarr. He fears your blood. And once you stand in that circle, once you place your hand on the speaking stone, there will be no hiding what you truly are." The implications of their warning struck him like a physical blow. The speaking stone of Ironmoot was more than just a symbol of authority. It was a relic from the earliest days, imbued with power to compel truth from those who touched it. But if the stone's magic interacted with his own bloodline, if it revealed secrets he didn't even know he possessed, then we're already too late, he said quietly. Because refusing to speak would be an admission of guilt that Ragnar could use just as effectively. Around them, the crowd grew restless, waiting for his response to Ragnar's challenge. The moment of decision had arrived, and there was no path forward that didn't lead through revelation and confrontation. The wolf winter was beginning in earnest, and like it or not, Ulfarr found himself at the center of the storm. Ulfarr descended the stone steps toward the center of the amphitheater with the measured pace of a man walking to his execution. Around him, hundreds of faces watched in expectant silence, their expressions ranging from eager anticipation to fearful dread. The speaking stone waited at the circle's heart, a pillar of black granite taller than a man, its surface carved with runes so ancient that their meaning had been lost to all but the most learned scholars. As he approached, Ulfarr could feel power radiating from the stone like heat from a forge. This was no mere ceremonial marker, but a genuine relic of the elder days, when the barrier between the world of men and the realm of gods had been thinner than morning mist. His ancestors had brought it here from some forgotten shrine, embedding it in this sacred ground to ensure that truth would always be spoken at their moots. Ulfarr Ketilsson, Ragnar's voice followed him down the steps. It pitched to carry to every corner of the amphitheater. Son of Ketil the Red, brother to Magnus the Untested, you stand accused of bringing corruption to the bloodlines of the North. How do you answer? The accusation hung in the air like a challenge to single combat. Ulfarr reached the speaking stone and paused, his massive hand hovering inches from its carved surface. Once he touched it, there would be no controlling what truths might emerge. The stone would compel honesty, but it would also amplify whatever magical heritage flowed in his veins. I stand ready to speak truth, Ulfarr said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. But first, let those who would judge me hear the full context of the tale they seek to understand. Without waiting for permission, he placed his palm flat against the speaking stone. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Power surged through him, like lightning through a storm-touched tree, racing along pathways in his blood that he hadn't known existed. The stone began to glow with an inner radiance that cast sharp shadows across the amphitheater, and when Ulfarr spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the listener's very bones. 7 years ago, I was exiled for a crime that was no crime at all, he began, the words emerging with a clarity and force that surprised even him. I was banished for falling in love with a woman who carried the blood of the old powers, and for losing a sacred treasure to forces beyond my understanding. Around the circle, gasps arose from those who had expected either denial or confession, not this strange blending of both. But the stone's power was working now, drawing truth from depths Ulfarr hadn't known he possessed. The arm ring of my fathers was no mere ornament, he continued, feeling the stone's magic pulling memories from the shadows of his mind. It was a prison, forged by my ancestors to contain a fragment of divine essence stolen from the gods themselves in the earliest days of the world. When Astrid Goldmane fled my hall on our wedding night, she carried with her not just a treasure, but a curse that would split her very soul. The human Astrid had risen from her seat in the crowd, her face pale but determined. As the stone's radiance touched her, she too began to glow with inner light, and Ulfarr realized that her proximity to the speaking stone was awakening powers that had long lain dormant. The exile was my choice, Ulfarr said, his voice growing stronger as the stone's magic flowed through him. I could have pursued the fleeing woman, could have brought war to her father's hall and death to countless innocents. Instead, I chose solitude, thinking to spare the world the consequences of my failure. But the gods had other plans, a new voice added, and every head turned to see the wolf Astrid stepping forward into the circle's heart. As she approached the speaking stone, her form began to shimmer and shift, cycling between woman and wolf with increasing frequency. They sent me to watch over him, to protect him, to prepare him for the day when his true heritage would be revealed. Ragnar had been listening with growing alarm, clearly recognizing that his carefully laid trap was becoming something else entirely. Enough of this witchcraft, he shouted, his hand falling to his sword hilt. "You speak in riddles and claim divine purpose for what any honest man can see is corruption and curse." But the speaking stone's power was reaching its crescendo now, and neither Ragnar's words nor his weapons could silence what was being revealed. Ulfarr felt the barriers in his mind crumbling like ancient walls before a flood, releasing memories that belonged not to him, but to his bloodline itself. "My ancestors were not merely heroes," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of centuries. "They were the children of gods and giants, the bridge between the world of men and the realm of eternal powers. The arm ring was forged not to imprison stolen divine essence, but to contain their own godlike heritage when it threatened to burn away their humanity." The implication struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. If Ulfarr spoke true, and the speaking stone compelled nothing but truth, then the old bloodlines were not merely noble by accident of birth, but carried within them the literal legacy of the gods themselves. "This is why you fear my return, Ragnar Bloodfang," Ulfarr continued, his gaze fixing on his challenger with unwavering intensity. "Not because I bring corruption, but because I bring remembrance. Your new order depends on people forgetting what they once were, accepting that strength of arm and cunning of mind are sufficient to rule. But you know, as I am beginning to know, that true leadership requires something more." The wolf Astrid had reached the speaking stone now, and as her hand joined Ulfar's upon its surface, a transformation began that defied every law of nature. The assembled crowd thought they understood. Light poured from the stone in waves that seemed to carry substance, washing over everyone present and awakening in them memories of dreams they had forgotten, of legends their grandparents had whispered when the winter nights grew long. The light that poured from the speaking stone grew brighter until it seemed the very air caught fire with divine radiance. Within that blazing illumination, the wolf Astrid's transformation reached its climax. But instead of shifting between forms, she began to merge with her human counterpart, the two halves of her divided soul drawn together by forces older than the stone itself. Ragnar could bear no more. With a roar of rage and desperation, he drew his blade and charged toward the circle's center, his followers rising from their seats to support him. But the moment his feet crossed the sacred boundary, the stone's power struck him like a hammer blow, sending him staggering backward as if he had run into an invisible wall. "You cannot silence truth with steel, Ragnar Bloodfang," Ulfarr said, his voice now carrying the authority of generations. Around them, the merging of the two Astrids continued, accompanied by a sound like distant thunder that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "The stone recognizes you for what you are, a man of great ambition, but no divine spark. You may lead armies and conquer kingdoms, but you cannot rule those who carry the blood of gods." The assembled crowd watched in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded before them. Where two women had stood moments before, now there was only one, Astrid as she was meant to be, whole and radiant with power that made the air itself shimmer around her. In her hands, she held the golden arm ring that had started this entire saga. But now it blazed with the same light that flowed from the speaking stone. "The curse is broken," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater without effort. 7 years of division and pain ended at last. But the breaking of one curse reveals another, the curse of forgetting that has fallen upon the northern peoples. She raised the arm ring high, and its light merged with that of the stone, creating a pillar of radiance that reached toward the grey sky. In that light, visions began to form, images of the past that every person present could see as clearly as if they were memories from their own lives. They saw the first kings of the north, titans who strode across battlefields like living storms, and whose word was law from the frozen wastes to the southern seas. They saw the gods themselves walking among mortal men, teaching them the arts of war and wisdom, of craft and courage. They saw the great works of the elder days, cities that touched the clouds, ships that sailed between the worlds, and weapons that could shatter mountains. But most importantly, they saw the bloodlines, the careful interweaving of divine heritage with human mortality that had created the noble families of the North. Not accidents of birth or political convenience, but the deliberate preservation of godlike power in forms that could guide and protect the common folk without overwhelming them. This is what Ragnar would have you forget, Ulfarr said as the visions played out around them. This is why he fears the old bloodlines and seeks to replace them with his new order. He knows that when the divine heritage awakens, when the old powers stir again in the world, his reign of mere mortal ambition will crumble like sand before the tide. Ragnar struggled against the invisible barrier that held him from the circle, his face twisted with fury and something approaching desperation. "Tricks and illusions," he shouted. "Ancient magic used to blind you to present realities. What good are your divine bloodlines when the Saxon kings gather their armies? What protection do your godlike ancestors offer when the southern lands mobilize for conquest? I offer strength in the here and now, not dreams of a glorious past." For a moment, his words seemed to carry weight. Several of his supporters nodded agreement, and even some of the traditional clans looked uncertain. The present world was indeed full of real threats that required practical solutions. What use were divine bloodlines against steel and fire? The answer came not from Ulfarr or Astrid, but from Magnus himself. Ulfar's younger brother had been silent throughout the confrontation, watching with wide eyes as his exiled brother revealed truths that transformed everything they thought they knew about their family heritage. Now, with the stone's light touching him as well, Magnus began to glow with his own inner radiance. "Brother," Magnus said, his voice stronger than Ulfarr had ever heard it, "I understand now why Father sent you into exile. Not as punishment, but as preparation. He knew this day would come, knew that the old powers would need to awaken again to face the challenges ahead." The young Jarl stepped forward into the circle, and as he approached the speaking stone, his transformation became apparent to all. Where before he had seemed scholarly and weak, now he carried himself with the bearing of a true king. The divine heritage was awakening in him as well, triggered by proximity to the stone and his brother's awakened power. "Ragnar speaks truly about the threats we face," Magnus continued, placing his own hand upon the stone. "The southern kingdoms do gather their armies. Dark powers do stir in distant lands, but he is wrong about the solution. We do not need to abandon our heritage to face these challenges. We need to embrace it fully for the first time in generations." The stone's radiance intensified further, and now the crowd could see other figures beginning to glow throughout the amphitheater, members of the old bloodlines feeling their own dormant heritage stirring to life. Not all of them, and not with the same intensity as the royal brothers, but enough to make it clear that the divine spark had not been entirely lost to the passing years. Ragnar's support began to waver as his followers saw the display of awakening power. These were not mere tricks or illusions, but genuine manifestations of forces that could reshape the world. In the face of such revelations, purely mortal ambition seemed suddenly small and inadequate. "The wolf winter is ending," Astrid said, her voice carrying a note of prophecy that made every listener's blood stir with recognition. Not because the world ends, but because it begins anew. The old powers return not to destroy what we have built, but to protect it against the darkness that gathers in the south. The light from the stone began to fade, but its effects remained. Throughout the amphitheater, men and women sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed and felt. The political landscape had been transformed in a matter of minutes. The careful plans of years undone by the revelation of truths that could not be denied or ignored. Ragnar stood at the circle's edge, no longer the confident challenger, but a man whose world had crumbled around him. His followers looked to him for guidance, but what could he say in the face of divine manifestation? How could mere mortal ambition compete with the awakened blood of gods? The moot was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. 3 months after the moot at Ironmoot, Ulfarr stood once again on the cliffs of Svartalfjall, But this time, he was not alone in his exile. The mountain had become a place of pilgrimage, where young nobles came to learn the old ways and awaken whatever divine spark might flow in their veins. Below, in the valleys, the northern clans had united under Magnus's renewed kingship, their ancient feuds set aside in favor of preparing for the greater conflicts that loomed on the southern horizon. The transformation had not been without its costs. Ragnar had fled north with his most loyal followers, taking ship for the icebound lands where rumor spoke of dark powers willing to bargain with desperate men. His departure had avoided civil war, but it had also created a new threat, one that would need to be faced when the spring thaws opened the sea lanes once more. "Do you ever regret it?" Astrid asked, joining him at the cliff's edge where their story had begun. She had chosen to remain in her unified form, though sometimes in the early morning light he caught glimpses of golden wolf eyes looking out from her human gaze. The arm ring gleamed on her finger now, no longer a prison but a symbol of power reclaimed and properly channeled. "Regret what?" Ulfarr replied, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "The quiet life, the peace of solitude. Before the raven brought word of the outside world, you seemed content here." Ulfarr considered the question as he watched the sun climb higher over the peaks. Content was perhaps too strong a word. He had been surviving, enduring, marking time until death claimed him. But there had been a simplicity to that existence that he sometimes missed, especially in the dark hours when the weight of renewed responsibility pressed heavy on his shoulders. "I regret the time we lost," he said finally. 7 years when we might have been together, might have been working to understand the powers that shaped our fates. But the exile itself? He shook his head. No. Without those years of solitude, I might never have learned to see clearly. Without the mountain's lessons, I would have been just another hot-headed warrior charging into battle without wisdom. From the cave behind them came the sound of young voices raised in discussion, Magnus's eldest son and daughter, along with several other noble children, debating the finer points of runic lore under the tutelage of an elderly skald. The next generation was learning not just the warriors' skills their parents had mastered, but the deeper mysteries that had been nearly lost to the passing years. "The southern kings grow bolder," Astrid said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "Our scouts report armies gathering in numbers not seen since the time of Charlemagne. They know what happened at the Moot, know that the old powers have awakened in the north." "It frightens them, as it should," Ulfarr replied. "But fear makes men dangerous as well as cautious. We'll have war before the summer is done, mark my words. Then perhaps it's time we gave them something worth fearing." The suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. The awakened bloodlines possessed power beyond anything the southern kingdoms had faced before, but using that power would transform the very nature of warfare itself. Once gods walked openly on battlefields again, the world would never be the same. "Magnus thinks we should try diplomacy first," Ulfarr said. "Send envoys, offer treaties, demonstrate that our awakening doesn't threaten the southern lands. And what do you think?" Ulfarr was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where storm clouds were gathering. In his mind, he could see the visions the speaking stone had shown them, not just the glorious past, but glimpses of possible futures. Some showed the Northlands burning under foreign conquest, their people enslaved and their heritage forgotten. Others showed a world transformed by the return of divine power, but at a cost that would make the old wolf winter seem like a gentle spring rain. "I think," he said slowly, "that the choice may not be ours to make. The world is changing whether we will it or not. The question is whether we guide that change or are swept away by it." A sound from below caught their attention, the horn call that announced arriving visitors. Ulfarr looked down to see a small party climbing the mountain path, their rich clothes and careful formation identifying them as another delegation from the lowlands. It seemed there was no end to the stream of supplicants seeking audience with the awakened bloodlines. "More petitioners?" Astrid asked. "Most likely. Though these bear the colours of the Western clans, Magnus's allies rather than ambitious rivals. They made their way down to meet the delegation, following paths that had become worn smooth by constant traffic. The cave that had once sheltered a single exile now served as an informal council chamber, its walls hung with maps and its floors covered with furs where visitors could rest after their arduous climb. The delegation's leader proved to be Eric Ravencrest, the same warrior who had challenged them on the road to Ironmoot. But where he had once shown fear and suspicion, now his manner was one of respectful determination. Ulfarr Wolfwalker, Eric said, using the title that had become common throughout the Northlands. I bring word from the king, and a request that cannot wait for the formal council meetings. Speak freely, Ulfarr replied, settling onto a stone seat carved from the living rock. What troubles bring you to my mountain? Ships, Eric said simply. 50 of them, maybe more, flying colours we don't recognize. They were spotted 3 days ago off the Whale Islands, sailing in formation and making no attempt to hide their approach. Our sea scouts say they'll reach the mainland before the week is out. Ulfarr felt his blood chill. 50 ships represented a significant force, not large enough for a full invasion, but more than adequate for a devastating raid. And the timing, coming so soon after the Moot's revelations, suggested this was no random act of piracy. Ragnar, he asked, though he already suspected the answer. The scouts couldn't get close enough to be certain, but the lead ship matches descriptions of his vessel. If it is him, he's found allies somewhere in the frozen north, allies with ships and warriors to spare. The implications were staggering. If Ragnar had indeed made common cause with the icebound kingdoms, if he was returning with foreign support to challenge the awakened bloodlines, then the conflict everyone had hoped to avoid was about to begin, whether they were ready or not. How long do we have? Astrid asked, her tactical mind already working on the problem. Perhaps 5 days before they make landfall, Eric replied. Magnus is mobilizing the coastal clans, but after 3 months of political awakening, we're not exactly prepared for immediate warfare. Ulfarr rose from his seat and moved to the cave's entrance, gazing out at the afternoon sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships full of enemies were approaching his homeland, with violence and conquest on their minds. The peaceful interlude was ending, just as he had known it must, but this time, when battle came, it would not find him unprepared and alone. Tell Magnus we'll be there within 2 days, he said, decision crystallizing in his mind like ice forming on still water. The mountain has taught us what it can. Now it's time to see if those lessons are worth the blood they'll cost to implement. As Eric's delegation departed with their message, Ulfarr and Astrid began their own preparations for descent. The quiet life was ending once more, but this time they faced the future together, armed with knowledge of their true heritage and the power to protect what they held dear. The wolf winter was over, but the season of testing had only just begun, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, enemies approached who would soon learn what it truly meant to face the awakened blood of gods.